Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the audio diary. I appreciate you sticking around. Drop a note below about where you are tuning in from today. It comforts me to know these broadcasts reach beyond my four walls. I am Vesper Sterling. If you asked me 2 weeks ago, I would have sworn my existence was the definition of mundane. I am 54. I spent 2 decades managing the archives at the county library in Salem, Oregon. I drive a rusted Subaru out of sheer stubbornness. My days followed a predictable rhythm, and I liked it that way. My husband Julian passed away 16 months ago. It was a massive stroke. He was just sitting on the porch, reading the Sunday paper, and then he was gone. We shared 28 years of marriage. Not perfect years, because perfection is a myth sold in movies, but they were deeply woven years. I loved him quietly and completely. The grief hit me in waves. Some days I could function, other days I couldn't get out of bed. Last Thursday, I drove down to the Oak Creek Credit Union. My goal was painfully simple. Julian and I had a forgotten emergency fund. I figured it held about $500, maybe enough to fix the gutters. It was the absolute last piece of paperwork tying his name to mine financially. I just wanted the closure. I handed my ID to a young guy behind the counter. He had a nervous energy and typed my account number into his terminal. I watched his face freeze. He blinked hard, swallowed, and pushed his chair back. He mumbled something about needing supervisor approval and practically sprinted away. I honestly thought nothing of it at first. Maybe the account was frozen because of Julian's death certificate. I leaned against the counter and checked the weather app on my phone. Then the regional director walked out. Her name was Mrs. Gable, and she looked at me like I was a ghost.
Mrs. Gable wore a stiff blazer and a deeply uncomfortable expression. She asked me to follow her into a private room. Her tone wasn't a request. It was a gentle command. She shut the heavy oak door behind us and sat down, lacing her fingers together. "Vesper," she started, her voice unnaturally low. "Before I process any paperwork, I have to ask you something directly. Do you know the exact balance of this mutual fund?" I sighed, feeling a bit annoyed by the theatricality. "I assume it's around $500, give or take." She didn't speak. She just rotated her flat-screen monitor so it faced my chair. The digital numbers glowed starkly against the white background. $31,804,219.14. I stopped breathing. The air in the room felt thick and heavy. I read the digits again, my brain violently rejecting the information. $31 million in a dusty emergency fund I thought we abandoned a decade ago. "Vesper?" Mrs. Gable leaned forward. "You honestly had no idea?" I shook my head. My throat felt like sandpaper. She explained, choosing every syllable with agonizing care, that the bank couldn't authorize a withdrawal today. The account had triggered automated flags due to massive, unusual activity over the last 4 years. Millions of dollars moving around. She advised me to get legal counsel immediately. I don't remember the drive back to my house. I must have stopped at red lights, but my brain was completely offline. I parked in my driveway and just sat behind the steering wheel while the engine ticked. When I finally forced myself through the front door, the silence of the hallway crushed me. Julian's favorite boots were still sitting by the radiator. Everything looked normal, but the reality of my life had just fractured. $31 million. I am not a paranoid woman. I trusted Julian with my life. But standing alone in our hallway, a cold, sickening doubt crept into my chest.
I started questioning every memory I held dear. What about those sudden weekend conferences in Seattle? The time I found a prepaid cell phone in his golf bag and he laughed it off as a joke from his buddies. Whenever I walked into his home office, he always seemed to click out of a window just a second too fast. Had I been a fool? Had my deep love for him blinded me to a glaring, dangerous double life? And the most terrifying thought of all, who else is aware of this money? I barely slept. I tossed in my bed while the digital clock glowed red in the darkness. 2 in the morning, 3 in the morning. Finally, I threw off the blankets. I marched into the kitchen, turned on the harsh overhead light, and grabbed the metal lockbox I kept hidden in the pantry. After Julian's funeral, I had sorted through his life insurance and our tax returns. I thought I had mapped out our entire financial footprint. We lived an incredibly average life. We clipped coupons. We debated whether we could afford name-brand groceries. Nothing about our lifestyle justified a secret fortune. I fired up my old laptop and navigated to the credit union's website. My hands shook as I typed in my password. The dashboard loaded. The numbers mocked me. Over $31 million. I clicked on the transaction history tab, and my heart hammered against my ribs. The log stretched back 4 long years. Massive wire transfers kept rolling in. 600,000, 2 million. They all originated from a shell corporation called Vanguard Horizon Logistics. Julian was a mid-level supply chain manager. He didn't own corporations. He routed trucks. Then I saw the outgoing money. Almost everything was incoming, but right near the top of the ledger, just weeks before his fatal stroke, there were 2 massive deductions. Someone or something had withdrawn $900,000, followed by another flat $2 million. Both transactions were routed to an offshore routing number I couldn't identify. The blood rushed to my ears. I stared at the screen until my eyes burned, the harsh blue light illuminating my empty kitchen. My first instinct was to pick up the phone and call my daughter Claire in Denver. She was always Julian's little girl. They adored each other, and she still called his voicemail just to hear his voice. But how could I drop a bomb like this on her without having a single solid answer? I couldn't risk breaking her heart all over again, not when I didn't even understand what I was looking at. I needed a lawyer, but not the friendly golfing buddy Julian had hired to draft our mundane wills. That man belonged to Julian's world. I needed a shark, someone entirely independent, someone who owed absolutely no loyalty to the ghost of my husband. I also desperately needed to figure out what the hell Vanguard Horizon Logistics actually was. When the sun finally came up, painting the sky a bruised purple, I didn't go to the archives. I called my supervisor and took a sick day for the first time in 6 years. I didn't dare open my own laptop again. An entirely new instinct had taken root in my gut overnight. Sheer, icy paranoia. If Julian was moving $30 million through hidden channels, who was watching those channels? Were they watching me now? I grabbed my coat and my keys. Instead of using my own internet provider at the house, I drove across town to a dingy cyber cafe near the university campus. I paid a teenager $5 in cash for an hour on a sticky public computer terminal. I pulled my hood up, kept my head down, and started typing. I was about to rip the lid off a secret that Julian took to his grave, and I had absolutely no idea if I would survive the fallout. Vanguard Horizon Logistics was a ghost. According to the state registry, it was a Delaware-based LLC. That meant practically nothing on its own, considering half the shell corporations in the country use Wilmington addresses to hide their sins. There was no website. There were no press releases. But my blood turned to ice when I found the managing member's name buried in the corporate filings. Marcus Thorne. I knew Marcus. He was Julian's college roommate and the best man at our wedding. I hadn't seen him in 15 years. Julian casually mentioned a falling out years ago, something about Marcus getting tangled in ugly logistics contracts and Julian needing to distance himself to protect our family. I had nodded. I had poured another cup of coffee and trusted the man I shared a bed with without a second thought. Sitting in that sticky, dim cyber cafe, I stared at Marcus's name and thought about the $31 million and those two massive, unexplained wire transfers. A cold, absolute resolve settled over me. I wasn't going to close that mutual fund yet. I wouldn't breathe a word of this to anyone until I had the high ground. I needed a lawyer. Not a friendly estate planner, but a street fighter who handled financial fraud. Fear is a strange thing. Yes, my hands were shaking and my chest felt impossibly tight, but I was quickly learning that fear isn't weakness, it is data. It is your brain screaming at you to wake up and pay attention. I drove back to my empty house and grabbed a legal pad. I sat at the kitchen island and started writing down every single name from Julian's past, every acquaintance, every client, every name I had been too blindly devoted to question. A librarian colleague of mine had once survived a vicious, high-asset divorce. She used a Portland attorney named Naya Adebayo. She is the one you call when you want to burn the house down, my friend had told me. That sounded perfect. I called Naya's office that Wednesday and demanded an appointment by Friday afternoon. Nia Adebayo's office was in downtown Portland. There was no mahogany or oil paintings, just glass, steel, and ruthless efficiency. Nia was in her late 40s, a first-generation Nigerian-American with piercing eyes and a demeanor that made you feel like every syllable you spoke was being weighed for a jury trial. I laid my nightmare out on her glass desk in chronological order. The credit union visit, the staggering balance, Vanguard Horizon, Marcus Thorne. I handed over my printouts and the entire contents of Julian's lockbox. Nia didn't interrupt me once. When I finally stopped talking, the silence in the room was deafening. "Vesper," she said, her voice completely devoid of warmth. "Tell me about Julian's will." I explained that I had probated it myself. It was incredibly simple. He left everything to me and our daughter, Claire. The whole estate was valued around $400,000. House equity, a retirement account, his car. Nothing remotely close to $30 million. Nia tapped a silver pen against her notepad. "That emergency fund was a joint account," she explained. "Legally, the moment your husband died, those funds passed directly to you by right of survivorship. They bypassed the probate court entirely." I hadn't known that. The golf buddy lawyer never bothered to check our joint accounts. "But," she leaned forward, "the origin of that money is the live grenade in your lap. If it represents the proceeds of a criminal enterprise, it creates massive legal liability for you. We need to know exactly what Vanguard Horizon Logistics was doing." She recommended a forensic accountant she used regularly, an ex-Treasury bulldog named Silas Vance. I agreed immediately. I wrote the massive retainer check without a single tremor in my hand. I still didn't call Claire. I went back to the county archives. I sorted historical records. I ate my packed lunches. But my reality had fundamentally shifted. Then, the watching started. It began with a charcoal gray SUV with Washington plates. It idled at the end of my cul-de-sac twice in 5 days. Different spots, same tinted windows. Then came the phone calls. Dead air when I picked up, followed by a soft click. Finally, almost 2 weeks after I hired Naya, a voicemail tarped onto my phone. A slick, overly familiar male voice. "Hey, Vesper. It's an old friend of Julian's. I heard you were asking some questions around town. Let's grab a coffee and catch up." I didn't call him back. I sent the audio file straight to Naya. She told me to lock my doors and document every shadow. Silas Vance worked with terrifying speed. Barely 3 weeks later, he called Naya and me into the glass office. He dropped a thick, red-tabbed folder onto the table. For the better part of 7 years, Vanguard Horizon Logistics had operated as a money laundering funnel. 3 massive commercial shipping contractors in the Pacific Northwest were deliberately inflating their supply chain costs. They skimmed the excess millions, ran them through Vanguard, and distributed the cash to a small ring of consultants who provided fake invoices to make it look legitimate. Julian was one of those consultants. Marcus Thorne orchestrated the entire machine. But here was the sickening part. The $31 million wasn't entirely Julian's cut. Based on Silas's forensic tracing, Julian's actual illicit earnings hovered around $10 million. The rest of it was parked in our joint emergency fund because Marcus Thorne needed a temporary vault while he restructured their offshore routing. Julian willingly offered up our name as that vault. Those two massive withdrawals right before his stroke, they went directly into Marcus's personal offshore accounts. Julian knew everything. He participated in every lie, and when his heart gave out on our porch, he left me holding a bag filled with millions of dollars that Marcus Thorne firmly believed belonged to him. I sat in that immaculate Portland office, the floor dropping from beneath my feet. The man I cherished for nearly 30 decades built an empire of deception right under my nose. Julian hadn't protected me. He simply died, leaving me squarely in the crosshairs of a very dangerous man. "Vesper, we are at the edge of the cliff," Nia said, breaking through my shock. "Whoever left that voicemail already knows you are digging. Marcus is circling." Her advice was brutal but clear. We had to strike first. While the money was technically mine by survivorship, Marcus or the federal government could easily freeze it with a civil forfeiture claim the second this came to light. The window was closing fast. Nia laid out a two-step war plan. First, we would voluntarily approach the IRS Criminal Investigation Division. We would disclose the account and offer Vesper Sterling as a fully cooperative witness, not a criminal target. Being the one to blow the whistle before an investigation officially opened offered a massive layer of legal armor. Nia filed the court documents on a rainy Thursday morning. Silas Vance assembled a bulletproof financial dossier. By Friday afternoon, Nia was on a conference call with a senior IRS agent in Seattle who logged the voluntary disclosure without drama and ordered us to freeze the funds pending their review. I drove home that evening in the pouring rain. I walked into my kitchen and made my usual Friday dinner, baked salmon and asparagus. I sat alone at the small wooden table, chewing mechanically. I crossed the Rubicon today, I thought. I officially exposed my husband as a criminal. He was no longer a man I could protect from the world's judgment. But beneath the suffocating grief, something new and fierce was blooming in my chest. For the first time in 16 months, I felt something entirely alien. Agency. I had actually done something. I made a choice. That Friday night, I slept for 5 solid hours. It was the deepest rest I'd managed since walking into that credit union. But the illusion of peace shattered on Saturday morning. The phone rang. The voice on the other end was like oil, smooth, polished, and nauseatingly familiar from decades of Thanksgiving dinners. Marcus Thorne. He bypassed the empty pleasantries entirely. Vesper. Just my name. He said it with the exhausted patience of a man who firmly believed his tolerance was a gift. "We need to have a serious conversation about the mess you've been making this week." He knew. Of course he knew. A man like Marcus didn't move millions without eyes everywhere. Julian used to joke that Marcus could hear a pin drop in a locked vault. I kept my breathing shallow and my voice completely flat. "Marcus, I don't believe we have anything to discuss." Silence hung on the line, heavy and sharp. "I'm going to say this exactly once as a courtesy to Julian. Whatever paperwork you just filed, whoever you talk to, rip it up. You have no idea what the actual chessboard looks like. Julian made certain guarantees to certain people. Those guarantees did not vanish just because he died." I gripped the edge of the kitchen counter. "What kind of guarantees?" "The kind that will make your life a living hell," he replied smoothly. "The kind that invites the federal government to tear your life apart. You are sitting on a mountain of cash you claim you knew nothing about? How do you think that plays to a jury, Vesper? Do you look like a naive widow or a silent partner who spent years reaping the benefits and now is trying to run?" It was a threat wrapped in fake concern. I told him I had retained legal counsel and that he could speak directly to her. Then I hung up. I dropped the phone on the counter, walked over to the living room couch, and sat there completely frozen for 10 minutes. My knees simply refused to hold my weight. When I finally called Nia, she didn't even sound surprised. "He is probing the perimeter," Nia said flatly. "He wants to see exactly how terrified you are. The fact that he called himself rather than deploying his lawyers tells me he knows his legal standing is garbage. If he had real leverage, he would have served you." She ordered me to write down a transcript of the call immediately. 2 days later, Marcus's attorney formally requested a friendly sit-down to resolve estate confusion. Nia rejected it immediately. We heard nothing else that week, but Marcus's threat had buried itself under my ribs. He was absolutely right about one thing. My innocence could easily be painted as complicity. Julian's lies were now my liability. The next week, I took 4 days off. I drove out to my sister Alara's cabin near Mount Hood. I didn't tell her about the $30 million or the money laundering. I just told her the estate probate was getting vicious. I sat on her wooden deck, watched the pine trees sway, and forced myself to breathe. I refused to let Marcus break me, but I needed a few days just to exist as a human being before stepping back into the ring. When I returned home, I found a Pyrex dish of baked ziti wrapped in foil on my porch. A note was taped to the top. "Thinking of you, Linnea." Linnea was my neighbor of 12 years. I stood on my damp porch, holding that heavy glass dish, and the dam finally broke. The sheer, ordinary kindness of it completely undid me. I cried until my chest ached. Then I put the pasta in the fridge and opened my laptop. There was an unread email sitting in my inbox from Julian's younger sister, Vivian. Vivian lived in Seattle and had never been a comforting presence. Our relationship consisted of rigid holiday cards and forced smiles. There was always a quiet hostility simmering just beneath her polite exterior, a bizarre, unspoken competition for Julian's attention. After his funeral, she stayed at my house for exactly 2 days, criticized my coffee, and left without a backward glance. This email, however, dripped with uncharacteristic warmth. She wrote that her heart was just breaking for me, that grief was a terrible burden, and that she desperately wanted to drive down to Portland. She wanted to buy me dinner, talk about Julian, and discuss what comes next for my future. I read the screen 3 times. I forwarded it to Nia with a blank subject line and a single sentence. "I think she's fishing for Marcus." Nia called me back in less than an hour. Marcus and Vivian had run in the same social circles for years. Nia suspected Marcus was using Vivian to bypass my legal wall, send the grieving sister to extract information, play on my emotions, and maybe deliver an ultimatum. I drafted a reply to Vivian. I kept it politely opaque. I thanked her for her kindness, mentioned that probate matters were eating up all my time, and promised to reach out when things settled. She replied in exactly 12 minutes. "No pressure at all. Take your time. I am always here." The speed of her response confirmed everything. She had been staring at her phone, waiting for me to take the bait. I never replied. Instead, I built a fortress around my mind. At Nia's insistence, I hired a therapist, a blunt, pragmatic woman named Dr. Eris Mercer, who specialized in financial trauma. I saw her every Thursday. I also started having tea with Linnea. I never mentioned the money, but I talked about the agonizing betrayal of realizing your marriage was a locked room you were never fully allowed inside. Meanwhile, Agent Kale from the IRS confirmed our whistleblower status. They officially opened a criminal probe into Vanguard Horizon. After the IRS confirmation, Marcus's camp went dead silent. No phantom cars on my street, no cryptic voicemails.
But I wasn't stupid. Men who build empires out of stolen millions do not just walk away from a locked vault. He was simply redrawing his battle lines. I bolted my doors, I logged every unfamiliar vehicle, I spoke to Nia twice a week, and I waited. There's a very specific kind of calm that washes over you when you finally stop running. It isn't peace, exactly. It's the cold, hard realization that you have planted your feet and you will absolutely not be moved. They showed up on a rainy Sunday afternoon. I saw the vehicle pull up through the sheer curtains of the living room. It was a silver rental SUV. Vivian stepped out first, wearing a tailored trench coat and a rehearsed expression of deep sisterly concern. Marcus climbed out of the driver's side. He looked heavier than I remembered, dressed in that aggressively casual way wealthy men use to signal power. He was carrying a glossy paper gift bag. I watched them walk up the driveway. I took one long, slow breath. Then I ripped the front door open before they even reached the porch. "Vivian, Marcus," I said, my voice eerily calm. I wasn't expecting company. "We really should have called," Marcus said, flashing a smile that felt like a razor blade. "But we were just so worried about you, Vesper. We're family. Julian's death doesn't erase that." They were absolutely not family, but Nia had given me strict instructions. If they ambush you, let them talk, record the interaction mentally, agree to nothing. I stepped aside. They sat on my sofa. Vivian complimented my rug, the kind of compliment that really means she's appraising its value. Marcus placed the bottle of expensive Pinot Noir on the oak coffee table. It was a grotesque pantomime of normalcy. Then Marcus launched into his pitch. Marcus was a phenomenal liar. He spoke softly about Julian, framing their illicit supply chain skimming as a heavy burden of complex business realities. He painted Julian as a martyr who made tough choices to provide for his family. He insisted that involving the federal government was a massive mistake that completely exposed me to ruin. "The money sitting in that account is highly sensitive, Vesper," Marcus murmured, leaning forward. "There are people who have very legitimate claims to it. The government doesn't care about you. They will freeze your assets, seize your house, and drag your daughter's name through the mud. Julian never would have wanted this." Vivian reached out and touched my wrist. "He wanted you safe, Julian. Whatever mistakes my brother made, he loved you. We have a number in mind, a very generous settlement to make sure you are comfortable. All you have to do is drop this IRS nonsense." They were offering to buy me off with a fraction of the money I already legally controlled, just so they could steal the rest. I stood up slowly. "Thank you for coming. I will inform my attorney about this visit. Leave." Marcus's polished mask finally cracked. He stood up, his eyes turning dead and flat. "You are making a catastrophic mistake. Julian was stubborn too. He was reasonable until he wasn't, and then his heart just couldn't take the stress." My blood froze. A veiled threat about my husband's fatal stroke. I locked the door behind them and stood in the hallway, trembling. I wasn't just scared anymore. I was furious. I called Nia immediately. I was entirely done playing defense. Fast forward 7 months. February, the federal courthouse in downtown Seattle. We had secured the deposition room. I spent 4 hours answering every grueling question the DOJ attorneys threw at me. I didn't hide a single thing. Now it was Marcus's turn to face the firing squad. I wasn't allowed in the room for his deposition. Instead, I sat in a grim little coffee shop across the street, staring at my cold espresso, waiting for the empire to finally burn. I learned what happened inside that deposition room in fractured pieces over the next few days. Marcus Thorne walked in with 3 highly paid corporate defense attorneys. He carried the easy, practiced swagger of a man who firmly believed he was the smartest person in the room. He spent the first 2 hours casually weaving the narrative he must have rehearsed 1,000 times. He was merely an independent logistics consultant. Vanguard Horizon was a completely legitimate advisory firm. Any inflated invoices were the responsibility of the shipping contractors. Then Agent Kale dropped the bomb. He slid a thick binder across the table. It contained forensic wire transfers, internal Vanguard emails, and, most devastatingly, a transcript of text messages pulled from a second phone Julian had hidden in his golf bag. The texts between Marcus and Julian were painfully explicit. They joked about skimming the fat. They casually discussed moving offshore funds before the quarterly audits. But there was one specific text that completely gutted me when Nia read it to me later. We were sitting in the parking garage, staring at the concrete wall because neither of us wanted to go back out into the world yet. Make sure Vesper's name is on the secondary account. It makes the whole thing look like a boring household nest egg. Julian didn't put that money into our joint account to provide for me. He didn't do it to protect our daughter. He did it because my boring, mundane life provided the perfect camouflage. My absolute trust in him was literally the shield he used to hide stolen millions. I had loved him. I had grieved him until I was hollow. And this is how he used me. When Marcus Thorne saw those printed text messages, his slick composure finally fractured. He tried to pivot. He claimed the language was just industry shorthand, and making things look boring was just about streamlining tax compliance. But the DOJ prosecutor didn't let up. She marched him through the evidence line by excruciating line. Every lie Marcus told contradicted a previous lie. He claimed he didn't know Julian was getting nervous about the scheme. The prosecutor produced an email where Marcus explicitly promised Julian that the legal exposure is zero if we keep using Vesper's name. Marcus's lawyers called for 3 separate recesses. Every time Marcus came back, he looked older. He looked panicked. The charm and intimidation he relied on his entire life were utterly useless against a mountain of federal evidence. By the afternoon, his voice was thin and tight. He had contradicted himself 9 times. He invoked his Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination 14 times in the last hour alone. Vivian was hauled in as a material witness 2 days later. As it turned out, Marcus had been keeping her informed for years. He paid her under the table to keep an eye on Julian and manage his nerves when Julian started talking about walking away. Her fake sisterly concern was a paid performance. When the feds showed her the paper trail of her own betrayal, she apparently broke down weeping. I felt absolutely nothing when I heard that. A week later, Nia called me with the official DOJ ruling. Vesper Sterling was legally classified as a non-culpable third party. The federal government formally recognized that I had absolutely no knowledge of the money laundering and had never knowingly benefited from it. I sat on my living room floor for a long time after hanging up. The relief was immense, but it was suffocatingly heavy. Being legally cleared doesn't give you your husband back. It doesn't erase the fact that your 28-year marriage was built over a sinkhole. But it was the truth, codified in federal records, and that was something I could hold on to. The hammer finally dropped in late April. A federal grand jury indicted Marcus Thorne on 8 counts, including conspiracy to commit wire fraud, massive money laundering, and obstruction of justice. His high-priced lawyers immediately started begging for a plea deal. There would be no dramatic trial. The DOJ estimated Marcus was looking at 9 to 12 years in federal prison, plus total asset forfeiture. Vivian wasn't charged criminally. She was careful enough to stay on the margins, but she was hit with a civil order demanding she repay nearly $500,000 in gifts Marcus had funneled to her over the years. Then came the final accounting of the $31 million. The process took 4 agonizing months. The IRS forensic team determined that roughly $14 million was directly tied to the fraudulent logistics skimming. The government seized every penny of that to cover penalties and restitution. But the remaining balance, just over $17 million, was classified differently. It represented Julian's legitimate salary over the years, compound complex interest, and funds that the government simply couldn't definitively trace to the fraud. And because of my status as a surviving, non-culpable joint account holder, that $17 million belonged entirely to me. $17,300,000. I won't lie and say I felt like I won the lottery. I didn't feel wealthy. I felt burdened. Every dollar was stained with the knowledge that Julian had lied to my face every single day. The grief was still there, woven tightly with a cold, quiet anger. But I was not going to give the money back to the ether. I hired a ruthless fiduciary advisor Naya recommended. We locked the bulk of the $17 million into conservative treasury bonds and diversified trusts. I set up a massive, anonymous charitable foundation dedicated to funding the county library system I loved so much. I established an ironclad trust for Claire, structured so she would be secure for life, but wouldn't know the dark history behind it. I didn't quit my job at the archives immediately. I stayed for 6 more months. I trained a bright young archivist to replace me, threw a quiet goodbye party, and walked out the door with 2 decades of respect intact. Marcus Thorne pleaded guilty in October. He was sentenced to 10 years in a federal penitentiary. The federal government doesn't just take your freedom, they take your toys. Silas Vance, with the grim satisfaction of an accountant watching the math balance, told me they seized Marcus's penthouse in Seattle. They took 2 vacation properties in Lake Tahoe. They even impounded the vintage Aston Martin he drove to my house that Sunday. If he serves his full sentence, Marcus will be nearing 70 when he finally walks out. I thought about the man who sat on my sofa, handed me a bottle of wine, and claimed Julian wanted me protected. I thought about his quiet threat according to Julian's heart attack. The threat didn't break me. It just confirmed he was exactly the kind of predator Julian actively chose as a partner. Vivian called my cell phone twice after the judge finalized her civil repayment order. I let both calls go to voicemail. I deleted them without listening. Whatever she wanted, forgiveness, a loan, an audience for her tears, I simply didn't have it to give. That closure happens on my schedule, which might be never. The weeks following the final DOJ resolution weren't triumphant. Life doesn't wrap up with a movie score playing in the background. It was just quiet. It was the bone-deep exhaustion of a woman who finished a marathon she never signed up to run. The very first thing I did after Nia finalized the blind trusts was buy a plane ticket to the Isle of Skye. I had begged Julian to go for a decade. He always had an excuse. The weather was too unpredictable, the flights were too long, maybe next year. I swallowed those rejections quietly, never questioning if my own desires deserved space in our marriage. Now the phantom negotiator was gone. I packed a single duffel bag, bought a thick wool sweater, and flew to Scotland completely alone. I didn't plan an itinerary. I rented a tiny stone cottage near the jagged coastline and turned off my phone. For 3 weeks, I just walked. I hiked the damp green moors until my legs ached. I sat in corner pubs, ate fish pie, and drank dark beer while listening to the rain hammer the windows. It was the first time in years I allowed myself to simply exist without a schedule or an impending disaster. Sitting on a rocky cliff overlooking the freezing ocean, I realized something. Rest isn't just sleeping. Rest is the active process of pouring life back into yourself after someone else drained you dry. I returned to Oregon in June and started dismantling my old life with the exact same ruthless precision I used during the legal battle. I sold the suburban house. It was the perfect house for the fiction Julian and I had built, and I wanted no part of it anymore. I bought a much smaller, older Victorian home in Astoria, right near the Columbia River. It had a wraparound porch and a garden that desperately needed pulling. I claimed a small back room for my study. Julian absolutely hated dark paint. He claimed it ruined resale value. I went to the hardware store, bought 2 gallons of deep, moody indigo, and painted the walls myself on a Tuesday afternoon. I opened the windows, blasted old Fleetwood Mac records, and rolled the paint on. When I finished, I stood in the doorway with paint on my jeans. I felt a tight, hard knot in my chest finally unravel. It was just a bucket of deep indigo paint, but it was entirely mine. I didn't have to compromise or ask permission.
Claire flew up from Denver in late August. We spent 4 days together in the new house. It was the longest stretch of time we'd shared since Julian's funeral. On the second night, we sat out on the porch with glasses of white wine, and I told her the absolute truth. I laid out the money laundering, the secret phones, Marcus Thorne, and the federal indictment. She sat perfectly still for a very long time. When the tears came, they were fueled by pure, unadulterated rage. She was furious at the father she idolized. She had to grieve a second time, mourning a version of Julian that never actually existed. I didn't try to soften the blow. I didn't offer platitudes about how he really loved her deep down. I just gave her the ugly truth and let her sit in the wreckage. By the time she flew back to Colorado, the air between us had cleared. We stopped performing for each other. Our Sunday phone calls stopped being brief check-ins and turned into real, sprawling conversations about her career and her messy relationships. We built an entirely new foundation, and it is the single greatest gift I salvaged from this nightmare. I also went back to work, but on my own terms. I started volunteering at the State Historical Society archives. I didn't manage payroll or budgets. I helped people track down lost property deeds and forgotten family lineages. Decades of organizing files suddenly became a tool to help overwhelmed people find answers. I spend 3 mornings a week in the basement of the Historical Society. It is deeply satisfying work. It turns out you don't need a crisis to find purpose. You just need to pay attention to the people standing right in front of you.
Part 21. Linnea and I transitioned from neighbors to actual friends, the kind of friendship where you don't bother cleaning the kitchen before they come over. We signed up for a stained glass making workshop in the fall. We were both catastrophically bad at it. We ruined expensive glass, burned our fingers with soldering irons, and laughed until our ribs hurt. I realized that unfiltered, ugly laughter is a mandatory requirement for survival. We paid for the advanced class without even asking each other. My sessions with Dr. Mercer shifted from crisis management to a slow, deliberate excavation of my past. I am finally looking at the ways I shrank my own personality to keep the peace in my marriage. The work is ugly, and sometimes I leave her office furious, but I wouldn't trade it for anything. Marcus Thorne surrendered to a federal penitentiary in Nevada right before Thanksgiving. I read the tiny news blurb online, locked my phone screen, and went outside to prune my hydrangeas. I felt absolutely nothing for him. He built his own cage, wire by wire. The justice system just finally turned the key. Vivian, I heard through the grapevine, had to liquidate her home to satisfy the government's repayment order. She moved into her niece's damp basement. The financial ruin apparently broke her completely. I don't feel smug about it. I just feel a profound sadness over the waste of it all. She had plenty of chances to step away from Marcus, and she actively chose the money every single time. As for me, I finally feel like Vesper. Not Julian's quiet wife, not the grieving widow. I am a woman forged in a fire I never asked for, and I walked out of it owning myself completely. If you found $30 million of dirty money and a predator at your door, what would you do? Drop a comment below. Thanks for listening.